Hi everyone. So what you're looking at is the scored PSG report. We're just going to go through it and I'm going to point through some of the important components. I understand that the video quality might not be the best, or depending on the screen size that you're watching this from, it might be really difficult to see what I'm pointing out. So if you want to follow along on the actual PSG report itself, you can find this scored report under the additional resources content area in Blackboard in the PSG 120 Blackboard course. And then if you click on the folder patient charts, there's the whole list of all the patient charts that we utilize for practice. And this one that I'm going through right now is scored report number 1. So the cover page, you don't want to blow past it because it does usually have a lot of important information. We can look at the patient's gender, their age, their BMI. So this is a 59-year-old male. His BMI is 29 and it is in the overweight category. Look at his medications. If you're not familiar with the medications that you're looking at, this is where you want to use your drug cards. That's why you're making them. And look them up because some of them might have, especially the antidepressants, they can have a significant impact on the sleep and can help better tell the story of what we're looking at when we actually go through the scored report. And you'll find a lot of the medications that you see tend to be fairly common or recurrent. So you look it up a few times, it might start committing to memory what it is. Like, oh yeah, warfarin, I saw that on the last chart. That's a blood thinner, that type of thing. And then just quickly read through the collection notes because sometimes that might house some information that the tech experienced with the patient that they really wanted to make sure was front and center when you're looking through this chart. So let's go to the next page. The second page is just the montage. You can kind of skip it. Lists all the different electrodes and things that were monitored. So page 3 is where we're going to get a really good idea of how the patient's sleep architecture is. We can see the lights out was at 10:47, lights on was at 5:03, giving this patient a total recording time of 375 minutes. So that's a little over 6 hours. So right there we can see that this patient really isn't giving themselves the recommended 7 to 8 hours of sleep. So they're already cutting themselves short. You'll also see that a lot of times the labs, each report is variable based on what lab you're looking at is from. But a lot of times they'll have a little extra information like sleep period time, total stage changes, that type of thing. The biggest things that you're looking at are the things that we're going to go through today and also the things that are in the PowerPoint to follow along and in the procedure as well. So the patient's total sleep time was 252 minutes. So that's short. They slept 252 divided by 60 is how many hours? Let's do the math. Feel free to have a calculator next to you if this makes it a little bit easier for you. So a little over 4 hours they slept, yielding a poor sleep efficiency of 67%. Normal sleep efficiency is greater than 90. So what this means is that the patient spent a great deal of time in bed where they weren't sleeping. That could either be that they had difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or they woke up early in the morning and laid in bed for a while before they actually got up out of bed. So let's keep going to figure out what happened. Sleep latency is normal at 10 minutes. And the wake after sleep onset is elevated at 113 minutes. So wake after sleep onset, a normal wake after sleep onset is about 10%, less than 10% of what the total recording time was. So a normal WASO would be around 37, 38 minutes. This one's at 113 minutes. So we can tell, what we can see from this is that the patient didn't have trouble falling asleep. They fell asleep in a fairly short amount of time, but they had trouble staying asleep because the wake after sleep onset is elevated. Their REM latency is 195 minutes, which is elevated, normal being between 90 to 120 minutes. None of the medications on the previous page really stuck out that would cause this delay. But if you looked at the REM latency less the wake time, so what this means is that if the patient was able to stay asleep, how long would it have taken them to get into REM? That was closer to normal. So their REM latency really isn't pathologic here, because if they were able to stay awake, then they did get into REM in a fairly normal period of time. So what you really want to look at then is what's keeping them awake. That's more the issue here. Let's go through the different stages. So this patient had 42% of stage 1, normal being between 5 to 10%. So stage 1 is very elevated here, which means that the patient, even the sleep that they are getting is not a quality of sleep, because remember, stage 1 is a very light stage of sleep. It's a transition between wake and 1. Stage 2 is right around normal at 48%, because normal is between 45 55. So he's pretty normal with his stage 2. There was no stage 3. Now this is where his age comes into play. He was a 59-year-old gentleman, I believe. And so he still should be getting some stage 3, not close to 20%, but some. And so this is somewhat kind of stands out. REM, he only got 11% of stage REM, normal being 20 to 25%. So what we can tell from this first page, let's sum it up and put it all together. The total recording time was low, so the patient didn't even give himself enough time to get a good night's sleep. His total sleep time was even lower, leading to a poor sleep efficiency. The sleep latency showed that he didn't have trouble falling asleep, but the WASO showed that he did have trouble staying asleep. So his total sleep time being at slightly over 4 hours, the sleep that he is getting, what we're seeing from the breakdown of the different sleep stages, is poor quality. He's having a lot of the lighter stages of sleep and not nearly enough of the deeper stages of sleep. So let's go on to the next page and try to figure out why this might be happening. Okay, so the next page is, I'm going to try to zoom up a little bit, is more of the respiratory results that you're looking at. So I know it's somewhat hard to tell, but there are some bolded numbers here, and those are really the ones you want to look at. So, but you want to look at the whole thing as well. We have how many central apneas they had, how many obstructive and mixed, so the total number of apneas, and if you come down to the second line here, that gives you the index. So his apnea index was 13. Surprisingly though, the apnea index was mainly central apneas. So be really careful about just jumping right to saying he had OSA based on his RDI or AHI. What type of apnea did he have? If we go over further, this next bolded number in the second line is 45. That's his AHI, his apnea-hypopnea index is 45, and that is severe. Add in the RERAs, and his RDI is 52. So this is the one thing that I always see messed up, is you see that, well, all respiratory event index was 52. What's the actual name for that? It's RDI. This is the respiratory disturbance index column. It's just not labeled that way, but you still need to know what you're looking at. So his RDI is 52, which demonstrates he is in the severe range. Come down a little bit further, you can look at what the average length of each of these types of events were, what the longest event was. So the longest hypopnea was 74 seconds. The longest central apnea was 35 seconds. Then we can further break it down between REM versus non-REM. So what I really do is I come down and I jump down here. So the REM RDI compared to the non-REM RDI. They are the same. So that demonstrates they're both 52, that he does not have a REM component to his disordered breathing. The next chart will break down his respiratory events based on his position. Now, this chart further breaks it down between when he was supine on his back, supine REM, supine non-REM. That's really getting into some quite detail, and we don't need to get into that much of a detail. We really want to see, does he have a supine component or doesn't he? So if it helps, what you can do is just cover up the REM versus non-REM, and just really what you're looking at is the total sleep time. So this patient spent 208 minutes, or 83% of his total sleep time, on his back. His RDI on his back was 57. On his side, he only spent about 17% of his sleep time on his side, but his RDI was 30. So there is quite a discrepancy here between the supine and the non-supine RDI, which demonstrates this patient does have a supine component to his disordered breathing. Now let's be a little extra here and compare the AHI versus the RDI. So the AHI, there's a really significant difference between supine and non-supine sleep, which shows that the severity of the event type. So think of OSA as a spectrum disorder, with apnea being the most severe of the type of event, hypopnea being midline, RERA being more on the milder end of the spectrum of sleep disordered breathing. Remember, AHI only is apneas, hypopneas, RDI is apneas, hypopneas, and RERAs. So the event type that the patient is having on their back is significantly worse compared to non-supine. So when he's on his side, he's having mainly RERAs that are contributing to this RDI, where when he's on his back, it's mainly apneas and hypopneas leading to this elevated AHI. So sum it up, this patient has severe sleep apnea based on his RDI of 52. Notice I didn't commit to central or obstructive, and if you're not really sure, you don't have to. But we know he has sleep apnea. There is no REM component because the REM index, the REM RDI and the non-REM RDI are the same. But there is a supine component as demonstrated as this discrepancy between the supine RDI and the non-supine RDI. Let's go to the next page. So the next chart you're looking at is the limb movements. This one, again, breaks it down, gives you a little more detail. It has limb movements with arousals, limb movements without arousals, total limb movements, and the ones that are in a series. How they show up, whether or not they come in as the PLM series or total limb movements, is basically how the score tech is marking them. So the one you really want to look at is the total limb movement index, that number right there. Greater than 15, the patient is positive for PLMD, periodic limb movement disorder. This patient's limb movement index is 1, which demonstrates he is negative for that diagnosis. The next chart is his arousal events. This is where we're going to figure out what his level of sleep fragmentation was, how much he's actually waking up throughout the night, and find his arousal index. So again, it breaks it up into REM sleep, non-REM sleep, but the more important one that we're looking at is this one right here, which would be total sleep time. So if it makes it a little bit easier, you can even just, cover up the REM versus non-REM and really looking at the index. That's what I want to know. So the total index right here, this 39, which is on the bottom, is his arousal index. So he has an arousal index of 39, which indicates severe sleep fragmentation. If you'd like, you can further break it up into what caused the arousals. Respiratory related, snore related, PLM related, spontaneous. Well, this patient really just had respiratory related arousals. So that's it. Severe sleep fragmentation, negative for PLMD. Next page is his oxygen. So this chart can be a little complicated to read, but you want to look at it all. So we have the highest saturation level, the maximum, wake, non-REM, REM, total sleep time, just time in bed, his average, his minimum. So the one I will say that you can kind of ignore is the wake and the time in bed columns, because oftentimes you will get sometimes some crazy numbers because of the movement, when they're awake or just overall over the course of the study. You can get some really crazy low numbers because of the movement artifact. So there's not always necessarily accurate, but you really want to look at, okay, what was his average oxygen was 92. So that's above 90, which means it's in the healthier range. The lowest oxygen was 77. We can further break it down that the lowest oxygen was reached during REM sleep. But overall, throughout the course of the entire test, 29 minutes was spent with the oxygen below 88%. So that means it was in an unhealthy range for close to a half hour across the entire 6 hour, slightly greater than 6 hour recording that we did. The oxygen was in the healthy range for 78% of the time while he was asleep, and 22% of the night while he was asleep, or of his total sleep time, was spent with his oxygen in the 80 to 89 range. And again, you can further break it down to see, is there a REM component? These are fairly close, whereas 26% of his time in REM was spent with his oxygen between 80 to 89, 21% of his time in non-REM sleep was spent in the 80 to 89 range. So when you're going through this, you want to be really careful about saying his oxygen was good or it was unhealthy. You wanna be very careful about making those types of statements that put a label on it. You just want to more state the facts. And the other thing you can pick out here is the patient hypoxemic? So did they spend the majority of their night in an unhealthy range where their average saturation is 80, 89? That could be indicative of an underlying lung disorder. Heart rate results, so average heart rate, again, time in bed and wake. Sometimes you can get some crazy numbers based on movement artifacts. So really what we're looking at is total sleep time. This patient's heart rate was normal, average was 49, minimum was 43, which by technical standards is bradycardic, but in sleep it's really not pathologic until it goes below 40, because again, heart rate naturally drops slightly when you're asleep. This chart you can ignore. You probably won't ever see anything in that one. And then the last page is the histogram. So let's put it all together. Do I need to let me back it up just a little bit so we get the whole thing in. But yeah, so this is a page that is very helpful to actually show the patient when you are going through and explaining their sleep test, because sometimes it helps just to see it via a picture. Other times, sometimes you'll be able to pick up, say you missed something when going through the previous pages and the previous charts. You can pick up something here that you might have missed. And then maybe that'll help you go back through and be like, let me look at that chart again. Maybe I missed that there was a supine component, or that there was a REM component, something like that. So what we see here is the patient's sleep stages. We know that he fell asleep in about 10 minutes, but what you can see is there's some frequent stage changes. He doesn't really have any consolidated sleep, not till about right here. He finally gets maybe like a half hour or so of consolidated sleep where he's not waking up. Here's that prolonged awakening right there. So that could lead to why he had such a high WASO. We knew that he fell asleep all right, but he didn't stay asleep. So we don't know if he, with the arousal index, he woke up fairly often, but this also shows that he did spend a long period of time awake. It wasn't just a lot of arousals. Down here, you have all of his respiratory events. So you can kind of line them up to see the type of events that he's having. What you can see is all these events really line up with all these frequent stage changes here. The oxygen levels, you see these like how it gets thicker. That means it's going up and down, and it really correlates to these events here. Come down here and you can see if it lines up with the position. So the patient spent most of the night on his back, so he's on his back here. A bunch of it lines up right with a bunch of the events, the oxygen level dropping. Same thing with here, and same thing with here. So he really didn't sleep much when he was on his side, because this was long awakening, kind of correlates to when he first rolled over to his right side. And again, he didn't really have a lot of limb movement. So you can put it all together here. And, it's the picture version to really show all the numbers that you just read. So it's a helpful tool to utilize to practice going through and use it to your advantage. Hope this helps.